Let's actually do that for a moment before we jump into the scriptures. Would you? We're going to pray again. It's never a bad thing to do. So God, we bring these three priorities to you. We believe, God, that we're not asking out of our own intention, but God, that we feel that you're leading us to pray these things. And so God, we ask that you would provide a youth ministry coordinator, someone to work with our teenagers. God, we ask that you would provide the means to pay off the rest of our mortgage. And God, we ask, most of all in all of these, Lord, that you would bring 100 people to Christ through the ministry of Bethel Church over the next year, if not more. Jesus, that would encourage us and push us to be a people who are evangelistic in nature, taking the gospel into the world. And God, that you would go before us and that you would give us favor as we share Jesus with the people around us. Amen. All right, if you got a Bible with you, you can open it up to the book of Genesis, chapter 23. We're going to read together. It says this. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah, and Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abraham rose up from before his dead, and he said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and a foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. The Hittites answered Abraham, Hear us, my lord. You are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold from you his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead. Abraham rose and he bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land. He said to them, If you are willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and entreat for me Ephron, the son of Zohar, that he might give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. It is at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence as property for a burying place. Now Ephron was sitting among the Hittites, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites, of all who went in at the gate of his city. No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that's in it. In the sight of the sons of my people, I give it to you. Bury your dead. That Abraham bowed before the people of the land, and he said to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, But if you will hear me, I give the price of the field. Accept it from me, that I may bury my dead there. And Ephron answered Abraham, My lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver, what is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weights current among the merchants. So the field of Ephron in Machpelah, which was to the east of Mamre, the field with the cave that was in it and all the trees that were in the field, throughout its whole area was made over to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites, before all who went in at the city, the gate of this city. After this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as a property for a burying place by the Hittites. So there's a few things that we're going to draw out of this text this morning. The first is this. God's timing and methodology don't always line up with how we would do things. All right, so you read through the story of Abraham, and you're going to see this. God calls Abraham. He says to him, okay, Abraham, I want you to leave the place that you are. I want you to leave your father's household. I want you to go out to the place that I'm going to show you. And he promises Abraham that he's going to make him into a great people, which means that he's going to need an heir, that he is going to give him a land, and that all people will be blessed through him. Now what happens as you track through this is that God takes his sweet time in making these things happen, right? Isaac is not born until Abraham is pushing 100 years old. The land that Abraham inherits, he is now past that, and the way that he inherits it is that his wife dies and he needs to buy a place to bury her. Right, so I'm guessing at this point, like we generally know the story, but I'm guessing for Abraham as he's walking this out, he probably isn't thinking that this is the way that things were going to play out for him, right? He probably expected God to be a little bit quicker on his promise. He probably expected to see a little bit more of what he was told that he would get, and yet God is doing what he said he would do in his time, his way, and his methodology probably doesn't line up with exactly what Abraham was expecting. Right, I think most of us have on some level experienced this kind of reality in our lives. I shared last week that I was in a car accident around the time that I was 23, 24. Caitlin and I had just been married. It's the sole reason that I am here with you and not playing professional sports somewhere, right? But I remember that, that car accident it was not fun. I was off work for 5 or 6 months. I had major shoulder issues, back issues, headaches as a result of it. Tylenol 3 was my constant and close companion, right? And so it wasn't great. And yet God used that circumstance to provide for us over the course of the next still to this day, because we got an insurance settlement that allowed us to have a down payment for a house, right? That's not the way that I would have personally scripted things, right? Somebody would have just magically given me the money for the house. That would have been great if I didn't have to have the pain and all these things. And yet God was working things out in his sovereignty, in his way, honestly, something that I wouldn't have chosen for myself. And so when we look at the scriptures, when we look at our life experience, I think that we need to come to a place where we just acknowledge that things don't always run down the way that we want. And at the same time, God is at work accomplishing his purposes, right? Those two things are not mutually exclusive. It's kind of where the question that people often press at us, why do bad things happen in the world? And man, that's a complex philosophical question. And at the end of the day, what we'd say is, man, even in the midst of bad things happening, by the way, you can't really say that bad things happen unless you believe in a moral framework. And if you have a moral framework, you have to believe in God. And so there's an argument there that we like to use that says for those who are skeptical towards the existence of God, you don't get to appeal to morality. You can't have morality unless there's a moral lawgiver. You need a God for that. It's a fun argument to use. But at the end of the day, we say, man, even when bad things are happening, which they do, we know that God is at work. We see time and time and time and time again in the scriptures that in the midst of pain, God is bringing about his purposes. Right? So just stick with me here for a moment. What that means for us is this. When you face hardship, when you face pain, you ought to recognize that God is still sovereign, that God is still at work. Don't run from him, but rather be allowed to mourn, right? Abraham mourns, he cries, he weeps. We know this. And yet he still trusts in God. And man, this is not trite, all right? This is the midst of Abraham losing his spouse. You will face things in life that are going to be difficult, that are going to be utterly painful, that will twist your soul. Yet know this, that in the midst of those things, God is still at work and he is bringing about his purposes. Remember, I've shared this before. I'll share it again, and maybe it'll be of some encouragement to some of you. When I was roughly 30, 31, 32, somewhere in my early 30s, it's all a blur, man. I was diagnosed with depression. And I remember, I don't even know if I could explain some of the, how do I say, not even the emotions, the just lack of emotion that existed in my life. Everything was bland. Everything was difficult. I remember spending like an hour and a half one evening just sitting looking at Netflix and unable to even pick something to watch. Like just things moved slow. Things didn't really, like everything was bland. I remember so many times hearing people say things like, man, in the midst of my darkest hour, I just knew that God was close. I felt it, right? You hear people appeal to that. And that's great. That is a real thing. But for me, I remember in kind of my dark moments, I did not feel the presence of God. But I had a knowledge in my head and a firm conviction that even in the midst of things going sideways, he was still good and he was still working out his purposes. And that knowledge in those moments saw me through it. And God was involved in that. I'm not saying that he was not involved, but I'm saying my feelings were not what kept me going. A knowledge of the fact that God is constant, that God is faithful, that he is working out his purposes is what sustained me in my dark moments. So all of that to say, I think we need to be willing to accept the fact that God is at work even when we are looking at situations like, man, that's not how I would have done things. Second thing we draw out of this text is that the possession of this land for Abraham is incredibly significant. Why is it significant? For starters, it's part of God's overarching promise to Abraham. We go back to the call of Abraham. What does he say? I'm going to give you a land, right? And then from there, what happens is that Abraham and his descendants' connection to that land is going to underlie the entirety of God's relationship with Israel. So what you're going to see is as the scriptures unfold, God is going to give Israel this land of promise. But it is based upon faithfulness to the covenant. And so if Israel is faithful and obedient, they will dwell in this land, and the land will provide for them. They will be fruitful. They will excel, essentially. There will be blessing. However, if Israel fails to walk in faithfulness and obedience, God says the land will be cursed, and the ultimate aspect of that is that Israel will actually be uprooted from that land and sent into exile. And you see all of those things play out. It's phenomenal. You read through one of the things I love, I believe it's the book of Joshua. It might be Deuteronomy. You see the people of Israel as they're coming into the land. Moses has instructed them essentially that half of the people should line up on one mountain and half of the people should line up on a mountain on the other side. And they essentially call back and forth to each other saying, if we do this, we will be blessed. If we do this, we will be cursed. And it is this reminder that they need to be faithful and obedient to what the Lord has told them. But what happens is constantly from their early days, you start reading this in the book of Judges, as soon as they possess this land of promise, Israel begins to go astray. Not only are they faithless, not only are they disobedient, they actually start worshiping other gods. And so what happens is God sends people against them. He removes his blessing, and in the land, they have all sorts of trouble, all the way to the point, you see this process happen, they repent, God restores them, the land, it's all good, then it's bad, it's good, it's bad, to the point where God says, that this is it, you are going into exile. And what happens is that the northern kingdom goes into exile under a nation called Assyria. They disappear. We don't know what happens to them. And the southern kingdom of Judah ends up going into exile under an empire called Babylon. They later on are restored to the land where they sit for 400 years before Jesus shows up. And during that 400 years, they are under the thumb of various empires. Right, so all of this is tied to this promise that God has with Abraham that there will be a land. So when Abraham, as an old man, finally purchases this land in the midst of pain and sorrow, he's seeing God's promise begin to come to fruition. Now, here's the fun part of this is that we see this kind of paradigm and this question about this land still being prevalent today. On one side of this discussion, you have Christians, and this is important for us to understand. It ties into this. On one side, you have Christians who are like, man, that land that Abraham inherited, that peace and that parcel that becomes Israel, that must still be Israel's land today because God promised it to Abraham. And on the other side, you got Christians who are like, no, the land doesn't have anything to do with Israel now because we're under a new covenant and all of the old covenant is fulfilled in Jesus, right? And there's this discussion that goes on, and then Christians are stuck in the middle of like, man, what do we do with this promise to Abraham all the way back, like, man, pushing 4,000 years ago, and this current struggle that's going on that's constantly escalating in this same part of the world, right? The short answer to this that I would suggest to you, and I'll be careful in navigating this, is similar to what we've talked about in weeks past. That there is a trend within the scriptures that moves from physical to spiritual realities. So whereas there is a physical tabernacle or dwelling place of God in the Old Testament, under Jesus you have a spiritual reality that God dwells in his people. You talk about circumcision, the physical marker of the covenant. You come to the New Testament and you see Paul writing especially saying, man, there's a spiritual circumcision. You are marked on your hearts, right? And so what we do with that is we say the land also has this sort of transition and trajectory. Where a physical land, the land of Israel, becomes a spiritual place, the kingdom of heaven. But then within that, what you also see, because you go too far that direction, you see in the book of Romans, Paul says, man, there's going to come a day before Jesus returns where ethnic Jews are going to turn en masse to Christ. So then we say, well, man, I think some of the stuff that's going on in the Middle East currently probably has something to do with that. But we got to tie all of those things together, and that can be a complex item to navigate. With all of that, what we see is that I think sometimes our picture of God's possession is a little bit too small in how this plays out. So one of the things that we have done in Western theology especially is somehow we have made this reality where God is interacting with a physical earth, physical people, physical realm. We said, okay, all of that's for now, and then God's going to be done with it someday. The earth is going to burn, and we're going to take off. I'll fly away, oh glory. I'll be in heaven, a spirit, a harp, playing a harp on a cloud, right? What we see scripturally is that the inheritance of God's people is actually more than just one piece of a physical land in the Middle East, but rather that God's people inherit the earth, made new. You read that in the book of Revelation. We talked about that this past week. That's all a little bit of the technical end of the pool. Third thing that we draw out of this text, the way that we interact with those around us matters. So we see that there are constant interactions between Abraham and the nations around him. I'll give you a little bit of a history and a geography lesson this morning. Israel, modern-day Israel, Palestine, where Abraham lived among the Hittites, is in what we call the Fertile Crescent. The reason that this is important is because for the majority of history, when you were reading especially the Old Testament, the world powers were at each end of the Fertile Crescent. Specifically, you had down towards what is now modern-day Iraq, nations like Babylon, Assyria. And then you have on the other end of the Fertile Crescent, Egypt. What you need to know is that between Egypt and these other world superpowers, the only path was through Palestine, through Israel. You couldn't go back and forth to each other to the east because they had what's called the Syrian desert. Well, you could say, well, why does that matter? It matters because God put his people of promise in a place where they would constantly be surrounded by and interacting with the world powers around them. Empire after empire after empire after empire not only was engaging with each other through Israel, trade ran through, they were right smack dab in the middle of the then known world. Why do you think God did that? because God wanted his people of promise to be interacting with the nations. He put them exactly where they would be known by everything that's going on. God is saying, hey, you're going to rub shoulders with some people. Every superpower that comes up is going to have to interact with you in some way, shape, or form. Right? And what we see is that this begins to take place already in the life of Abraham. Man, he is interacting with people from Egypt. He's interacting with Abimelech. He's interacting with the Hittites. And you see these interactions with the nations. Sometimes they are good. Sometimes they are not so good. Sometimes it's Abraham's fault that they're good, and sometimes it's Abraham's fault that they are bad. Sometimes it's the people, right? But there's these relationships that are going on that Abraham has been put in the middle of. And we read this text this morning and we see that the author seems to be painting this particular interaction as a positive exchange. And so can I suggest to you that there's a bit of a paradigm that exists here, in which when the world thinks well of the promise and the people of the promise are generous and kind to the world, this is a good thing. And we say now, especially as the promise of Abraham has been made manifest and available to all people who believe through Jesus, that this would continue to be a good thing. So track with me. This is where 1 Peter 2:12 lives. It says this: keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of his visitation. So we're seeing all of this unfold, and it would seem to me that the scriptures are pointing us towards this reality where the people who have embraced the promise of God are supposed to be people who are rubbing shoulders with the world around them and reflecting the God of the promise. And then what happens is, within all of that, we need to keep in mind the tensions that have existed throughout history. So track with me for a minute. Sometimes the temptation that we can have is be like, well, man, you read a verse like 1 Peter there that says, live good lives, let people see, and the temptation can become to be people pleasers. And the danger that exists there is we begin to compromise things that are clearly taught biblically. And we don't want to do that. And so while we are called to rub shoulders with the world around us and to rub off on the world around us and to make the promise known, there is a long history that exists in the reality of Christianity that says, man, the world's values and God's values, which are therefore our values, do not always mix well. And so we live in this tension where we're supposed to live real good lives that are godly, inspired by him, influenced by him, so that people would see who he is, that we would be a light and a witness, hoping that our interactions are positive, but also recognizing that at times, if we are living lives that line up with what God has called us to, that may cause some friction for us. The reality is, for those of us who are part of a Western heritage going back to Europe and the Roman Empire, for the last roughly 1,700 years, is the truth is we've had it pretty good. Since the time of Constantine, when we saw the Nicene Council, Christianity has had, generally in the West, some form of favor. But that's not every Christian's reality. In fact, there are many Christians who have lived outside of that reality and may not always be ours. And so all of that tells us that while we should be people of promise, rubbing shoulders with the world around us, doing our best to have good relationships, making Jesus known, we also need to live in a tension that understands sometimes that goes well, and sometimes, man, that can lead to friction and even persecution. Last thing that we draw out of this text this morning is that entering the promise of God usually involves pain and loss. And I can't tell you the number of times growing up that I went to youth conferences In any good youth conference verses, its salt has a few things. One is a lack of sleep. 2 is a high level of emotions. And 3 is some form of altar call that kind of uses those 2 things to really turn the screws on people. You're tired, you're emotional, now let me tell you about Jesus and try and press you towards an altar call. Whether that's good or not, we could argue. Anyways, generally what happens, and what I've heard so many times, is the gospel presented in a way that says this is the best thing you'll ever do. Jesus is going to be real good for you. Your life will be a lot better because of Jesus. And those things are technically true. Actually, they're very true. But truth without context can be a problem. See, because context tells us that while responding to Jesus' call to come and follow him is a good thing, it will be good for you. You will be blessed because of it. Context tells us that Jesus also says things like, hey, pick up your cross and follow me. Or he says things like, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no part of me. Or he says things like, let the dead bury their dead. See, while the reality is that responding to Jesus' call to make him king, or not even make him king, to recognize him as king and then to live a life according to that, the truth is, while that will be great for you, it will also almost always cost you, and you will face pain because of it. So for those of you who are here this morning, you're like, man, I've already bought into that. Jesus is king in my life. I'm following him. Can I just remind you this morning that the biblical reality is, in this life, until Christ calls you home or he returns and we see that new heavens and new earth, there will be pain and there will be suffering, there will be sorrow, there will be loss. I promise you. Do not be shocked when it comes. Do not lose heart when it comes. And then also know that you have a hope that transcends it. There is an eternity ahead of us enjoying the goodness of God. For those of you this morning who are here, you're like, man, I don't know where I stand with Jesus. There is an invitation for you. And in fact, it's not even an invitation, if I'm honest. There is a demand to you from Jesus to bow your knee and to recognize him as king. And the reality is, he is a good king. The metaphors the scriptures use over and over again show us that God is fatherly. Jesus is like a big brother, that he is loving, that he is merciful, that he is a shepherd. He is good to his people, but he is king. This is not a democracy. And can I tell you this? That recognizing that and stepping into that through what we call faith or belief, where you trust Jesus and his goodness and his kingship, will be the best thing that you ever do, and it will also be incredibly costly. And it will likely involve some level of pain for you. And it may involve loss. But it is worth every bit of it. So God, this morning as we reflect on this passage, Lord, where Abraham begins to realize the promise through loss and through pain, we recognize that that is in a lot of senses also true for us. God, we've known loss, we've known pain, and yet we are a people of promise. And so God, I pray that in the midst of those moments that we have had, maybe we're having right now, that we will have, God, that you would be the one who sustains us. Because we know that you are good on your promise. We know that there is a possession that you have already given us, that you are giving us, and that we will inherit. And God, that even though there's pain and there's loss now, there is good to come. And so, Lord, would you help us to be a people whose eyes are on you, who are looking forward to your kingdom, your reign, and your coming. We ask this all in Jesus' precious name. I invite you to stand with us as we sing one more song this morning.